What's happening, everybody? Justin, Bridgewater's finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, fueled as always by the incredible folks at NerdTees, and welcome to Week 10. We finally hit the double digits. Week 10 of my weekly CFL football pick show for the 2019 CFL season. What a up and down and weird season it's been. We had ourselves a good week last week, and we bounced back from the week before. Went 8-4 last week across all of the picks from week 9 in the CFL. That includes a sparkling 4-0 straight up. When you get all the games straight up, you certainly put yourself in an advantageous position. Now, I only went even money on the betting picks. Was 2-2 against the spread, 2-2 on the over-unders. We're 24-11 straight up on the season. That's 69%, just below where we want to be. 21-14 against the spread, exactly where we want to be at 60%. 18-17 on the totals, just over 50%. 63-42 across all CFL picks this season. That is a clip of exactly 60%, and that's where we want to be. The Hamilton Tiger Cats have really opened things up in the CFL standings in the East Division, now holding what is essentially a 3 full game lead over the Montreal Alouettes, right behind them at 3-4. In the West Division, Winnipeg picking up that big win last week, the Battle of the West Division. Winnipeg takes the inside track at 6-2 in the West, and then you got a log jam back there of 3 teams, Calgary, Edmonton, and Saskatchewan, who's on the bye this week. All 3 of those teams are at 5-3. In the official Atlantic Schooners CFL Fantasy Football League, I dropped down a couple of positions last week. Wasn't a good week in terms of fantasy. I now sit in 16th place out of 67 people in that pool. They keep adding people to the pool even through the mid-season, which is nice to see. Only picked up 52.7 points with my Week 9 lineup. Did not do very well for me, unfortunately. 760.4 points overall. Has me, again, right in that nice meaty part of the top third in that pool. Actually, technically top quarter in that pool. My Week 9 MVP, not a whole heck of a lot to choose from, but I am going to go with John Crockett at the running back position. 13 carries for 89 yards. He had 2 catches for 19 receiving yards as well. It was worth 12.8 fantasy points. It was a decent performance. He's put up a string of some decent performances here. That was all it took to be my Week 9 MVP. And my Week 10 fantasy lineup is now in front of your eyes. We're going to rock Dane Evans here at the quarterback position. He was a pretty inexpensive option. Hamilton is playing an Ottawa team that is the worst secondary in the CFL, so we're hoping for some points with him. We're going to stack him with Braylon Addison, who got a little bit of time in the backfield last week, so may even get some rush yardage points out of him. Andrew Harris, obviously, we're stacking Winnipeg here, and Chris Matthews, just because Chris Matthews is now that deep threat in the Winnipeg receiving game with the injury to Darvin Adams. And we are going to roll with the Eskies defense because they're playing Toronto. I expect that to be a low-scoring game. That is your Week 10 CFL fantasy lineup. Your actual Week 10 lineup of games looks like this. You get the BC Lions traveling to Winnipeg to take on the Blue Bombers. Edmonton is in Toronto to take on the Argos. Hamilton travels to Ottawa to take on the REDBLACKS in a Battle of Ontario, but not the Battle of Ontario. And Montreal travels to Calgary to take on the Stamps. Let's start in Winnipeg there for that Blue Bombers matchup, playing host to the BC Lions. The Lions losing again last week. They've dropped 4 games in a row. They're only 1-7 on the season, and in those 4 games that they have lost, they have been outscored on average, get this, 38-21. They've been outscored on average by 2 full possessions. That is really, really not good. Last week, they dropped that 1-point decision in Hamilton, 35-34, and that was the backbreaker. As far as I'm concerned, that was the backbreaker for the BC Lions season. They are leading a great team, not a good team, a great team. Leading a great team by 15 points in the 4th quarter with about 10 minutes left in the game, and they still find a way to lose. It's kind of unfortunate because on the offensive side, they did some really good things. Mike Riley had a good game. He threw for 75%, threw 306 yards, threw for 2 passing touchdowns, added a rushing touchdown because he's Mike Riley. But he mitigated some of his own successes with 2 terrible fourth quarter interceptions. The first one led to a field goal. That was Hamilton's first points of the fourth quarter, and it really sparked that comeback. And the second one wound up being the Lions' last possession of the game when you're only down by a point. You're only down by a point. You're going to throw an interception. That also ruined what was a monster game from John White in the running back position. 15 carries for $124, and he found the end zone twice. That was White's first touchdown and his first 100-yard game since playing Toronto all the way back in week 4. On the Blue Bomber side, they got back on the happy side of par last week, sitting at 6-2 with a 26-24 victory over the Calgary Stampeders. Again, that was like that battle for the West Division. But let's be perfectly honest here. I think Winnipeg was actually pretty lucky to win that game. It took 2 punt return touchdowns in Janarian Grant's CFL debut to absolutely stole that football game. It's not like they didn't do anything good. Matt Nichols was hyper efficient in that game, almost 82% completions on his passes. Andrew Harris had 144 all-purpose yards because that's what Andrew Harris does. But it wound up giving them position, but no points. They generated virtually 0 points from either Matt Nichols or Andrew Harris. They were lucky they had Justin Medlock, who went 4 for 4 on his field goals. And they were certainly lucky that the defense absolutely showed up to play. Yeah, they gave up 24 points, but it was the secondary things that defense was able to do. They only allowed 316 yards of offense against to the Stampeders. They had 3 turnovers that they generated in that game. They had 4 pass knockdowns. Had they not done that, the game would have been a blowout. Calgary would have walked all over them. I mean, I've absolutely no faith in the Lions right now, obviously. The Bombers should pack the stat sheet in this one. I probably should have leaned on them even heavier in fantasy, to be perfectly honest. And that should be on both sides of the ball. Quite frankly, I think it's just a matter of time for Mike Riley. He was very briefly injured in their game last week. The offensive line's not good enough. He keeps getting hit. I think he was sacked 4 times in that game. It's a matter of time. He's going to get hurt, and he hopefully will not get hurt badly, but he's going to get hurt. It's just a matter of time. We're definitely on the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in this football game. We're going to take Winnipeg at home to pick up the win over BC. On the line, Winnipeg is an 11-point favorite at home, and this is a pretty popular underdog line to take. I'm seeing quite a few sources taking the BC Lions plus 11 or something like that in this game. I can't do it. I'm going to take Winnipeg to cover it. It's under 2 touchdowns. BC's not a good football team. They can't protect their quarterback. Yeah, John White finally had a good game, but it was his first good game in over a month. So does he repeat that performance? Be interesting to see. Winnipeg's defense is pretty darn good. I think they're going to get to Mike Riley. I think they're going to generate turnovers, and this thing has the potential to be a blowout. Even though the points that Winnipeg's been scoring, as has been pointed out a couple of times, a lot of it's just like these sort of deep splash, deep bomb plays. I get that, but the points are still going on the board, and nothing about BC's defense in the last month and a half, nothing about that defense makes me think that they're going to stop them. So we're going to take Winnipeg, and we're going to hammer Winnipeg minus 11 against the spread. We're also going to be over on the total. Total in the game set at 52 points. I'm going to go over on that. I cap it personally right around a mid-50. And again, the Lions defense, they're touchdown allowing machines. The Lions have allowed 27 pass or rush touchdowns this season. That is far and away the most in the CFL. It's an average of more than 3 per game. There's 21 points right there, and that's just an average. So the 52 points does not scare me in the least here. We're going to go over 52 in BC Winnipeg. Let's go to Toronto now, where the Argos, coming off their first win of the season back in Week 8, are now going to welcome in the Edmonton Eskimos. Eskimos got back on the happy side last week, picking up the victory. They're now 5-3. They beat Ottawa by a score of 16-12. Welcome to the CFL. That's a score that can happen in the CFL. Very low-scoring game, closer game than I certainly expected it to be. And when the Eskies needed a game breaker, when they needed somebody to grab the game by the throat and take it, it was CJ Gable, and that was exactly what he did. 2 touchdowns in this football game. Gable answering the call with 150 all-purpose yards. but it was really what Gable did on the game-winning drive for the Eskimos. Gable accounted for 35 of the 67 yards that the Eskies had on that drive, plunging it into the end zone on a 2-yard run. So that was his second touchdown of the game. As I mentioned, CJ Gable, definitely the MVP of that football game on either side. The Eskimos win the game by holding on a red zone stand. I think Ottawa was down to their 11-yard line. They forced 3 straight incompletions from Dominique Davis. They also racked up 6 pass knockdowns and 2 interceptions in their secondary. It's almost like Edmonton's got a really good secondary. Let's go to the Argos side of things now. And like I said, they picked up their first win of the season back in week 8. They're coming off of their bye. Might be the bye at the worst possible time. I guess if you win a game, you kind of want to keep it going. They won 28-27 against Winnipeg on their home field back in week 8. And McLeod Bethel-Thompson in that football game takes the game and the team on his back. 343 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. He also led the team in rushing. MBT did it all in that game. The Argos had 440 total yards of offense, which is pretty darn good against a Blue Bombers defense that is pretty darn good in and of themselves, and that really mitigated what the defense allowed on the ground. Winnipeg, 19 carries, 181 yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns as a team in that football game back in week 8. Toronto also had 14 penalties for 165 yards in penalties in that game. They also turned the ball over 4 times. So this is still a bad football team. It just happened that the miracle happened and McLeod Bethel-Thompson just said, okay, take the game here and we'll go. Which makes it all the more interesting what the Argos did in the trade market. The Argos trading for Zach Collaros from the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Collaros returning to Toronto, where did Toronto draft him? Or he played in Toronto, certainly. So they get Collaros from Saskatchewan in exchange for a late pick. I believe it was like a conditional 4th rounder, which we talked about last week. And that's coming off of McLeod Bethel-Thompson then having his best game of the season, unquestionably his best game of the season. Who gets the rock? I mean, when obviously Collaros not quite ready to come back yet, but when he is ready to come back, who gets the football? Because McLeod Bethel-Thompson just had himself a hell of a football game. I take nothing away from the Argos. They shocked the world back in week 8 on their home field, which is where they are this week. The question to me is, does lightning strike twice? And history suggests it probably doesn't. Barring the Eskimos having yet another one of those play like the better team and not win, have all kinds of yardage but no finish, barring another one of those performances, I think this is the Eskimos all day, even though the game is in Toronto. I'm going to take Edmonton to win this football game. Let's take the Eskies in Toronto to beat the Argos. On the line, the Argos are 8-point dogs at home, which does seem like a big number. It's a bit of a coin flip here, but even based on how the teams have been playing lately, and even taking into account the Toronto's coming off both that win and their bye, I think I'm going to hammer Edmonton here. I can't blame you if you want to go Toronto +8. I just don't think I can give that much credence to the Argos defense on back-to-back games. So I think we're going to go with Edmonton here. Let's take the Eskimos minus the 8 points. Total in the game set at 50 points, and this is one of the more confident totals that I'm on this week. I like this game to stay under. I've got it capped at a low to mid 40, so like 43, 44, something like that. And the last 3 head-to-head matchups between the Argos and the Eskimos, regardless of where the game was played, have not only gone under this number, they've gone under 38. 37 points is the most that's been scored in one of these games, the last 3 head-to-head between these two teams. I feel pretty good about the under here, so let's go under 50 points in Edmonton, Toronto. And before we move on to a Battle of Ontario, it is time to plug an Ontario company and plug the good friends that I have at NerdTees. Nerdtees.ca. Use that promo code BWFinest. That is going to save you 15% at checkout. That is going to get you free shipping in Canada on any order over $75. And there's so much goodness. Why would you not order more than $75? If you're in the US, 2 clicks of a button, everything's in US dollars for you and you get an excellent conversion rate. Today's blend, speaking of Ontario, we're sticking with the Ontario theme. Today's blend is the Ontario Peaches. Delicious, excellent late summer. I assume this would be very, very good cold. I've never tried it cold, but I assume it would be quite good. And it sure smells good. Once again, nerdtease.ca, use that promo code BWFinest. That's going to save you 15% at checkout. Save your money, get your free shipping, find yourself something to love, or find someone you love something to love. You can do it on nerdtease.ca. Let's head to the nation's capital now. Hamilton in town to play the Ottawa REDBLACKS. Hamilton gets back in the winning column. They're now 6-2 on the season. That 1-point victory against the BC Lions. The defense propelling them to a wild 15-point fourth quarter comeback. Hamilton, in fact, scoring the last 16 points of this football game after going down by 15 very shortly into the beginning of the fourth quarter. I think the biggest piece of good news for Hamilton to come out of that football game has got to be the fact that Dane Evans, for the first time, has a clean start. This was his first start in the CFL where he did not throw an interception, at the very least this season. And it was arguably his best game as a CFL quarterback. 23 of 32 passing, 260 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and once again, no picks. Clean game for Evans. As we mentioned before, the Ticats sacking Mike Riley 4 times. One of those 4 sacks coming from Simone Lawrence, who returned from his suspension in this game. 8 defensive tackles and again a quarterback sack. So Lawrence got right back into the swing of things. He's still an asshole, but he's a good player. The REDBLACKS dropped that aforementioned low-scoring 16-12 decision in Edmonton last week, back on the losing side after what was a decent performance. I mean, they played well in that game. It was decent, but just not quite enough. And when I say decent, I mean decent. Dominique Davis was decent in that game. 65.7% passing, 289 passing yards, that's fine. Only had the 1 pass touchdown and had 2 picks. Not great, decent. John Crockett was decent in that game. 108 all-purpose yards. There's nothing wrong with that. Maybe needed a little bit more, but he was decent. The defense, they bent. They didn't break. They certainly bent, but again, they didn't break. It was decent. They just needed a little bit extra. The one thing, however, that would be infuriating to me if I were a REDBLACKS fan, and certainly if I was a REDBLACKS coach, is the fact that the team on the other side took 100 yards in penalties. You should have been able to advantagize the fact that the other team took 100 yards in penalties. In fact, they took, 10 penalties for exactly 100 yards. Ottawa took 11 for 134. That's got to be infuriating because in such a close game against a team that is better than you, you have to take any advantage you can. That's an advantage when they take a football field's worth of penalties, except if you take more. I'm certainly looking for Dane Evans to continue to build upon his Week 9 performance. This is the worst total pass defense in the CFL in the Ottawa REDBLACKS. That's why I've got Evans as my fantasy quarterback this week. I expect him to build on the performance. I'd love to see a 300-yard game, couple of touchdowns, keep the picks clean. Obviously, if I'm expecting that kind of performance at the quarterback position, I expect the Hamilton Ticats to win the football game. That's the way we're going with this one. Let's take the Ticats in Ottawa to beat the REDBLACKS. This is also the weirdest spread that I've seen this week. I assume that Brandon Banks ran off and joined the circus because Ottawa is only a 2.5-point dog at home, which is paramount to saying that Hamilton is only better than Ottawa by 5 points, 6 points. So if you took this game and put it in Hamilton, would Hamilton be a favorite of under a touchdown? I would be surprised to see that. We like the Ticats to win, and 2.5 points is really not that much to give up, so we're going to lay those points for sure and hammer at -2.5 and say, thank you, Vegas, unless you know something that I don't. Total here is 49 points, and I actually think this is pretty well a perfect total. I wish I would have been able to get this line earlier in the week because I think it opened at a low 50, 52, 52.5, something like that. So I wish I would have been able to get it then. But we deal in the here and now. The here and now is 49 points. I'm going to skew under on it because I don't know what we're going to get from Ottawa on the offensive side. I have a general idea of what I'm going to get from Hamilton, but don't really know what I'm going to get from Ottawa. So I'm going to kind of play it safe there and a little bit of a sweat, I think, but we're going to stay under on it. Let's go under 49 points in Hamilton, Ottawa. And the last game we're going to look at this week sees the Montreal Alouettes traveling to Calgary to take on the Stamps. Montreal now down to 3-4 on the season, losers of 2 consecutive games, dropping that 17-10 decision against Saskatchewan. That game was in Montreal, and it was the first CFL game ever that was not played to completion due to weather. The game was called just before the end of the third quarter. The new rules, the new legislation in the CFL that says if the game is delayed by more than an hour, you call it. And I understand it. I understand why people are kind of upset about it and think it's stupid. Antonio Pipkin started this football game, played what I would describe as very poorly, and was benched in the second quarter. There are a lot of people in the Montreal media that are talking about, like, is that Pipkin's last game in Montreal? And I mean, if you've got a guy in Matt Schiltz that can do the same thing, I guess if someone's willing to grab Pipkin in a trade for like a late pick, maybe you might want to consider doing that. I don't necessarily know that Pipkin is going to get any better in Montreal than you've already seen him. The Owls were far from dominated in that football game. Like, it was a relatively close game. They just had a big bunch of nothing on the offensive side, due in no small part to the not great quarterback play. The only thing they had was they had a Shakir Ryan punt return touchdown, which were basically, aside from a field goal, their only points of the game. Good news and bad news for the Alouettes on the injury front. We'll start with the good news. Vernon Adams has returned to practice. That doesn't necessarily mean that he starts this week or even plays at all this week, but it's just good to see that he has at least returned to practice. The bad news being BJ Cunningham. He has gone to the 6-game injured list. He will not be returning until, gosh, what is that going to be, week maybe 16, 17. I'm sure Montreal's got a bye week in there somewhere. So the Stampeders losing last week for the first time in their last 4 games, dropping that 2-point decision in Winnipeg against the Bombers, that battle for best in the West. And there's no other way to phrase it. The offense and the defense for the Stampeders deserved to win that football game. They played well enough that both of those units deserved to win. It was the special teams unit that really screwed the pooch. Nick Arbuckle had 260 passing yards, had 3 all-purpose touchdowns in that game. As a team, the Stampeders carried the ball for 4.7 yards per carry. Nothing wrong with that, especially with a team that struggles to run the football. They only took 2 penalties in that game for 15 yards. Calgary deserved better in that one, but it was the 2 Winnipeg punt return touchdowns that just absolutely sunk the Stamps, and the special teams unit needs to be better. And for the Stampeders, the boys are almost back in town. Bo Levi Mitchell, Kadeem Carey, and Don Jackson all returned to practice this week. So imagine staggered out over the next 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, 2 to 3 to 4 games. All of those guys should be back in the lineup, and that is Calgary getting close to full power. And once Calgary gets to full power, watch out everybody else. I'm putting virtually no stock into that Stampeders loss last week because they certainly played well enough to win the game and deserved to win the game. What I am putting a lot of stock in is the fact that the Alouettes, and there's no shame in saying this, there's a lot of football teams that are in this position. The Alouettes need Vernon Adams Jr. to be 100% healthy. They need William Stanback, who did not play in that game last week. It was Jeremiah Johnson, and he played fine. But they need William Stanback to be 100% healthy in order to be the competitive and good football team that we've seen them be for most of this season. Maybe if the game was in Montreal, I would take a moment to pause, but we are definitely going to be on the Stampeders in this football game. Let's take Calgary at home to beat the Alouettes. On the line, Montreal is a 7-point dog on the road. Calgary favored by a full touchdown. And I'm actually hedging my bets on this one. I'm going to take Montreal +7. I don't see a blowout coming here. Over their last 4 games, respectively, Montreal and Calgary have had average scores of the exact same. It's 23-19 in Calgary's last 4 games, 23-19 in Montreal's last 4 games, both in favor of the 2 teams that are in this football game. So I think this is going to be tight. I think it's going to be relatively low scoring. We're going to be on the under on the number we're about to talk about, but I like Montreal to cover this +7 against the spread. Total in the game is set at only 51.5 points, but I think this is an under. I cap this thing at like a mid-40, like 44, 45 points. Defense is going to be the law of the jungle in this football game. I'm sticking under on it. We're going to go under the 51.5 point total. There you go, folks. Those are your picks for Week 10 in the 2019 CFL season. I'm going to go over them here with you one more time. I've got the Winnipeg Blue Bombers at home beating the BC Lions. We're hammering Winnipeg -11 against the spread in a game that goes over 52 points. I've got the Edmonton Eskimos going into Toronto, hanging a loss on the Argonauts. We're hammering Edmonton -8 against the spread. That's a bit of a coin flip. You can go either way on it. In a game that stays under the 50-point total. We've got Hamilton going into Ottawa, beating the REDBLACKS. We're going to be hammering Hamilton -2.5 against the spread in what was the easiest decision probably of the week. In a game that stays under 49 points. And in the weekly finale, we've got the Calgary Stampeders at home beating the Montreal Alouettes. But we are hedging our bets on that one and taking the Alouettes plus the 7 points against the spread in a game that stays under the 51.5 point total. I'm on 3 unders this week. Going to be all kinds of sweating going on those totals. That's it for me, Justin, Bridgewater's Finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, fueled as always by the incredible folks at NerdTees. Thank you so much once again for watching. Week 10 is in the books. Enjoy the games. We'll see you again for week number 11. Cheers.